Hello and welcome to Tribunate. Today's episode is the first in a new series of discussion videos. Our topic today is whether any attempt should be made to rebuild the structures of ancient Rome. Because Rome has been continuously inhabited since antiquity, there's really not too much left of the ancient city structures. Some structures, like the Colosseum and the Pantheon, are still in reasonably good shape. Many more remain only in smaller pieces, and many more still are completely gone. However, there appears to be at least some interest in restoring some of the more heavily damaged structures, or even rebuilding structures that have been fully destroyed. As of right now, mid-January 2023, there is a restoration being carried out on the Temple of Peace in the Roman Forum, which was originally constructed by Emperor Vespasian in 75 AD. It's a fairly conservative project. It's limited to restoring 5 marble columns that once stood at the entrance to the temple, and the plan is to have the work completed by Rome's official birthday on April 21st of this year, which, by the way, is the day that Rome's legendary founder Romulus allegedly slew his brother Remus, at least according to Ovid. But historical restorations and reconstructions are a complicated business. They raise a ton of questions that aren't always easy to answer. How faithful should we be to the original construction methods? Should we use new materials, or should we attempt to use the original materials that still survive, or both? Should we make allowances for speculation, or should we stick strictly to established facts? Is it ethical to sell tickets to this newly rebuilt structure? And is it a newly rebuilt structure, or is it a completely new structure? Why are we trying to rebuild this stuff anyway? What would the Romans think? None of these answers are all that simple. But to start examining possible attitudes toward these restoration and reconstruction projects, it may be useful to look outside of Rome, outside of Italy even, to Seoul, South Korea.
Yeah, as counterintuitive as that sounds, Korea being on the other side of the world and all, and Rome being so much the center of what we call Western civilization, to look to something on the opposite end. But there's a little-known event that happened, little-known in America anyway, little-known event where a famous gate called the Namdaemun Gate burned down in February 2008. It was situated in central Seoul. It was dated back to 1398 originally, the founding of the Joseon dynasty in South Korea, which was their longest reigning dynasty, and was dated back to when Seoul was established as the capital, and they had built walls around the city for the very first time. So it was a treasure of Korean architecture because it had survived the Japanese colonial occupation, where many traditional Korean buildings were burned down. But unfortunately, in February 2008, this building was also destroyed by a drunken guy who was upset about a real estate deal that went bad. And basically, there was a national outcry on how to proceed, and they decided overnight, basically, to rebuild the thing. That meant that they used traditional materials and resources and methods, and they even created a special kiln that was period accurate to 1398 for the creation of 22,000 roof tiles. So this process cost $14 million, and it lasted until January 2013. But now this gate sits in the middle of Jonggu in central Seoul and is a tourist attraction next to a huge market, Namdaemun, which is named after it, that is a center of global commerce and global tourism. So it's evidence of how you can take something that has historical ties to a city, is part of national identity, and restore it, basically overnight.
Now, I've never been to Seoul, and full disclosure, I didn't know this story until you told it to me. But I think one of the most interesting things about this story is what has happened since the restoration has been completed, the response to the restoration. From the people that you've spoken to, how would you characterize the reception of this restoration?
Generally speaking, from my time there, from my family that I have there, they don't give it much thought. It's viewed as effectively the same object. That is because some of it did survive, and maybe it's because it was fixed so quickly. So it is a little different from the Roman approach. But to the average Korean, if you said, is that Namdaemun Gate, they would of course say yes.
So the fact that it is not the precise original structure is less important than the emotions that the gate evokes and the historical place that the gate occupies in popular imagination. When you look at Rome, obviously, it's a completely different situation where most of the allure comes from the fact that we can't see what this stuff actually looked like.
Well, and even the ones that are, incredibly well preserved, they're all gray. They're all whitewashed, which lends to an opinion that has kind of taken over that the classical age was this, black and white history almost, where it's very funny. I've seen people talk about how gorgeous the classical aesthetics of white marble are, and in reality, this stuff would have been painted. It was actually kind of gaudy. It was the exact opposite of the austere reputation that it has. So even the stuff that does survive can lend a false impression of what the city would have looked like at the time.
That's right. Yeah. If you look at some of the reconstructions or the imaginations of Augustus of Prima Porta, if you look at the color schemes they put on him, it's terrible. It's really tacky.
He looks like a Wes Anderson character almost.
He does. But I think, like you said, the point about the white marble, I think a lot of our imagination of what ancient Rome looked like is informed by the buildings that we in the United States have built influenced by ancient Rome. And in fact, Roman architecture was not a stable, constant thing. They didn't have a single identifiable style that existed throughout the entirety of what we know as Rome.
Yeah, I think that's a given for any society that lasts for over 1,000 years, depending on whether we count the Byzantines or not. But, if for a 1,000-year civilization to assume that things would remain consistent architecturally is a bit of a leap. But I think that's what happens when we basically just have ruins to look at. You have to do a lot of digging, no pun intended, to find the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. The original one was heavily Etruscan influenced, whereas once the Etruscans were thrown out with the monarchy, they decided to go for a more Greek style because Hellenism was all the rage at the time. So you're exactly right. And that brings us kind of to a transition that I think, in my opinion, one of the big objections to a concerted effort to rebuild Rome is that sense of like, oh, Rome is timeless. Like, it was a timeless place, but we would be interposing ourselves on it. Whereas, the Roman actual lived experience of 1,000 years was full of dynamism, change, buildings going up, buildings coming down. The city was always dynamic, always in flux. And, needless to say, they restored their own city more than anybody. So I don't think that, from my vantage point, not saying this is why we should do it or shouldn't do it, but I don't think the classical Roman themselves would have a huge problem with rebuilding some of their great architecture.
Yeah, and this is one of those areas where you can see one of the sort of classic Roman virtues is that they were an enormously practical people. They were not overly given to sentimentality. For example, the home of Romulus, which was allegedly the home of the mythological founder of Rome, burned down multiple times, and the Romans didn't seem to trouble themselves with these sort of philosophical questions of, well, would it really be the same thing? Are we imposing our modern view? They would just rebuild the thing, and they did often.
Yeah, to me, I think that's the most that's the best window into how they would have viewed the situation, in my opinion, because the hut of Romulus was not just a building. It was on the Palatine Hill. During the Augustan age, it was right next to where Augustus lived. Not an accident on Augustus's part. But what he did in building that link is he solidified the connection. But the Romans had always viewed that as the hut of Romulus. And, archaeological research that has happened there has traced it back to the 7th century. So it does date to the right time period. Whether a historical Romulus ever existed or ever lived there is another question entirely. But there was a large wattle and daub hut on that hill, and they used it as a temple to Romulus. And so they conducted burning sacrifices in a wooden temple. And no surprise, we have on record, I think it's 4 to 5 times that it burned down entirely, and they rebuilt it right away. So it was an ancient building of religious significance, but it was also an ancient building to them, is I think the important thing. So to Augustus, this is a building that happened or was built 700 years before his life. And it was in a completely different architectural style. So right next to the glories of the Palatine Hill, the temples of Magna Mater, and the Palatine residence of the emperor, you have this just disgusting hut from when Rome was, a hovel, a sheep town. And so they kept it as is. And I think that classical architecture that we aspire to, kind of looks out of place in the modern world. That hut would have looked just as out of place next to the quote unquote modern buildings of the Palatine Hill in the 1st century AD.
It would have been comparable, I think, to Namdaemun Gate in that it was a reminder of where they had come from.
Yes.
And the home of Romulus burning down would not have been an especially unique scenario. I mean, these are people, like you said, they conducted burning sacrifices inside religious buildings, but you also had fire in virtually every building. I mean,
right.
They're using fire to light their homes. They're using fire to cook. Needless to say, they did not have the fireproofing abilities. They didn't have fire trucks. They had fire brigades, but they obviously didn't have, high pressure fire trucks. So stuff burned down all the time. And again, we see that sort of eminently practical Roman attitude of like, well, it burnt down, let's build it up again.
Yeah, it's not a rebuilding of a new building. There was a Roman religion was filled with a sense of continuity, in a sense that like naming something, attaching a name to something or putting a statue of a god in a place in some sense created a very real physical connection that I think a lot of us can't relate to that aspect of their religious life because of the monotheist culture that we grow up in, where God is not someone you can just literally chat up, or the Romans believed you had power over the gods to an extent if you gave them enough stuff. So the enormously practical approach explains why the religious structures were rebuilt, but they rebuilt everything. The Circus Maximus built, burned down, was expanded, was rebuilt, and all throughout the Circus Maximus, for example, you have little tokens of different eras of Roman history all displayed alongside each other. So trophies from different wars and campaigns, relics from consuls to emperors. It was really a panoply of, centuries of life collected there. But if it was destroyed, they did not hesitate to refer to that building as the same building, because in effect it was just defined by its purpose.
And speaking of the Circus Maximus, you made a comment earlier about a pun earlier about digging up the past. Something that I didn't fully appreciate for a long time is I believe the current Circus Maximus, I mean, it's still there. The space is still there.
Yes.
But as far as we know, the original Circus Maximus would have been about 6 meters lower than the current ground level today. And that's the truth for not just Rome, but a lot of the territories that Rome inhabited and where they constructed settlements, is that the actual ground has shifted enormously since then due to erosion, alluvial deposits from the Tiber. The ground, when we look at it today, is not the same ground in the same places that they would have seen it, which can make it harder to imagine the past, at least for me, thinking that there's 6 meters of dirt over what they walked on. It's kind of a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it was, up until the mid-Renaissance, the forum was being used to raise cows because they didn't know what was under there, right? So yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around, and I think it would be a significant challenge to any rebuild effort that anyone might engage in, because I think that the first thing that you should emphasize is preservation alongside restoration. The goal, like, because you had mentioned earlier that, there's a lot of artistic liberty that happens when we are forced to imagine what a certain temple looked like, because we only have limited information to go on, so that any effort to restore the past should definitely be dependent on being 100% reversible and, easily no impact to the actual historical site itself.
Yeah, definitely. But I think part of the reason that we attempt efforts like these, reconstruction, rebuilding efforts, is to help bridge that gap in imagination, is to help people overcome the difficulty of constructing a mental image or, looking at artist depictions. There's something different about having a physical structure in front of you that has mass that you can put your hands on.
Yeah, I agree. As somebody who's walked through the Forum, has been to, all these sites in Rome, I think, like, there is a certain, it is awe-inspiring to an extent, and there's a bit of reverence that comes with it, but I don't know the utility that the average person has when, like, I don't know the impact it had on the average person. So to me, it, like, seeing the Temple of Saturn, I think is very well preserved. The Temple of Antoninus and Fausta, very well preserved. The Curia, very well preserved, all in the Forum right next to each other. You can kind of put yourself there for a second. It takes a lot of work, but you can do it. Other areas of the Forum, really all you've got are just a collection of bricks. And I want to, go to my Sherlock Holmes mind palace and imagine it all laid out before me. And even as somebody who has a very high degree of knowledge of what to expect, I still don't get a lot out of it, truthfully. So to me, I think that there would be utility, and this is obviously not a decision that, and I'm not endorsing it, and I'm not saying it should happen tomorrow, but if a campaign were to be undertaken to engage in extensive restoration in Rome, it should be done with the utmost responsibility and in the sense of, like you said, inspiring reverence, awe, respect for the past, and not as like a cheap tourist gimmick, so that they could open a hot dog stand, inside of the Temple of Vesta, where you roast the hot dogs over the fire.
I believe that was the traditional preparation inside the temple
of hot dogs. Yeah.
Now, if we were going to look to potentially an example of how a reconstruction of Rome might be carried out, I think one of the best places that we could look to is Greece, appropriately enough, as Rome so often modeled itself after Greece. Greece has done a little more work in this department than, well, Rome obviously is a city and Greece is a country at this point, but with some of their most famous structures, for example, the Parthenon, the Stoa of Attalos, we've actually seen some of these efforts to restore what we have left of the structures to what it might have looked like in ancient times.
Yes, the Stoa of Attalos that you mentioned is probably the most ambitious, classical, full-scale reconstruction effort that has ever been undertaken. And it was the American Classical School of Athens undertook a campaign. They raised money. They did it in 1956, and they rebuilt this stoa that I believe dated to the 2nd century BC was when it was built, and it was stopped being used in the middle of the 2nd century AD. If that's when it fell into ruin, but they had enough to go on to create an accurate reconstruction of it. It's right outside of the Agora in Athens, so it's the equivalent of the Roman Forum. It would be like rebuilding the Basilica, Julian Basilica in the Forum. That would be kind of the equivalent, like a government building, or something, not a temple, but a commerce or government related building in the center of the city. And it houses a museum now, but there has not been significant public backlash to that project. Granted, the Stoa of Attalos is not a foundational building to Greek identity, like maybe the Parthenon is, which we'll discuss in a minute. But you're almost like when you because even I'm guarding my words. I'm being so careful in how I discuss these things because I can feel like the backlash coming. I don't even know if it's there, but I just feel like I'm proposing something that's like sacrilegious almost, just the effort to rebuild, even though I'm not really against it, but I feel like do you understand what I mean, right?
I do, and I think you raised one of the most common objections earlier when you suggested, just sort of, well, what's the point? To some people, the idea that you could help people have a richer historical imagination, or the thrill that they could put their hands on a structure that they've only read about, to some people that's enormously appealing, and to some people it can seem like a waste of time, waste of money, perhaps, even, as you said, sort of disrespecting the original sites by turning them into something touristy. It's the same sort of thing that you see. The comparison that comes immediately to mind is like going to the moon. To some people, it's self-evident, like, it's awesome. Of course you want to go to the moon. Of course you would want to rebuild Rome.
Yeah.
But it's a real, and I think legitimate objection that must be considered, to just say, well, you can't do something just because it's awesome. Like, there has to be some more practical justification for it. And I don't know that there is an extraordinarily clear justification for it.
Yeah, I don't think that given the resources that would need to be expended, to be perfectly honest, I don't think it passes the test of, would the city of Rome pay for this? Would the Italian government, the EU, whoever's footing the bill, the billions of dollars potentially, even in limited projects, if we want to be historically accurate in our reconstruction, if we want to employ the best archaeologists and stonemasons in the creation of these things, that would be tremendously expensive. And I don't think that public policy hinges on the outcome of our conversation, but I think it's a conversation that's worth having, because one of the things I think about is the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, which they've been building for nearly 100 years now, perhaps more, and I don't think it'll even be finished for another 20.
It's sort of an integral part of the identity of the church at this point, is that it's continually under construction.
Yes. And I think that there's something kind of beautiful about that, maybe because it is a religious building, and you're saying like, oh, this is, in 400 years when it's finished, our religious tradition will continue to thrive and people will be here, and you're planting a tree for generations that, will come after you so they can sit in the shade. But that's kind of how I approach this, where it's like, I just want the conversation to happen, and then people can decide. And, I don't expect a rebuilt forum in my lifetime or anything similar, but I would like the conversation to happen. And maybe in 600 or 700 years, if people finally have completed one temple, I'll just think that's really cool.
Yeah, it would be enormously cool. And I struggle to articulate a better reason, honestly. To me, it's so self-evident. But interestingly, speaking about where the funding for something like this would come from, with the Stoa of Attalos in particular, it was not the Greek government who was funding that reconstruction effort. That was, I believe, an American school based in Greece.
Yes, and they raised money through private donations. So I think the U.S. State Department, I think it might have been part of the Marshall Plan. Don't quote me on that. But, private donors, the Hearst family, I think they're Roman and Greek and classical people are out there, and some of them are very rich. And so before we move out of Greece entirely and back to Rome, I do want to say that perhaps the central facet of ancient Greek identity, or ancient Athenian identity anyway, the Parthenon, there is a limited reconstruction effort that is happening there right now as we speak. And I think that kind of flies under the radar because, if you talk about, hey, should we rebuild Rome? The natural reaction is just, no, get out of here. You're pissing on their graves by suggesting that. But there's not a big outcry over the effort to reconstruct. It's just the cella. So that's the area of the Parthenon where the statue of Athena was housed. And what's actually very cool is this has been a very intense process, but they've identified, from looking at the ground, where stones went. So 360 ancient marble blocks are being put in their original places, and they're going to have to add 90 new blocks, and they're going to have to cut them up, cut the new ones to fit with the old ones. But the fact that it's not just stone, it's not just stone from the site, like it's the actual block going exactly where it was, I think is incredibly cool. And obviously it sucks that the Parthenon is in scaffolding right now, but again, it's like the Sagrada Familia, where it's like, you know, will it be done in 45 years? Will I ever get to see it done? Maybe, maybe not, but it's happening, and that's exciting.
I agree. And in the case of rebuilding Rome, if we were to, if something like that were to be attempted to recover the original materials from which some of these buildings were constructed, we know that we could do that to at least a limited extent, because a lot of those stones are still around. A lot of those stones are in known locations because, again, in the spirit of Roman thriftiness and practicality, they're parts of other buildings now.
Right.
A lot of former Roman structures, or at least pieces of them, are now pieces of Christian churches around the city, or other, you know, walls, public structures, things like that. But then you run into another question, which is, do we pull them out because they are now doubly historic?
I think that's a super tough, like, ethical dilemma, because I mean, I couldn't, like, you know, the marble from the Roman Forum and Pompey's Theater that became St. Peter's, and there's no justification for, like, St. Peter's is a tremendous structure, and as cool as it would be to see these buildings restored with their originals, like, there's no justification for destroying something that is in the present, like, actually, you know, awe-inspiring as that cathedral is. But I think we have, and of course, what you mentioned about the city having risen so much is that a lot of these ancient sites are buried. So the last thing I want to do is dig up somebody's house and be like, hey, you know, Julius Caesar took a shit here, 2,000 years ago, so you're going to have to move. Like, I don't, but there are open air sites like the Forum. But the one that's really interesting to me is the Pompey's Curia. There is a place in Rome, right? So the Pompey's Curia was right outside of Pompey's Theater. Pompey's Theater was the first stone theater in Rome. It is a massive structure, and the shape of Roman streets still adheres to the general outline and the curve of the theater 2,000 years later, because it was around for so long and they had to build around it even after it had fallen into disuse and disrepair. But I think that so there's this place called the Lago di Torre Argentina, which is just an open square where the modern street is about 6 meters higher than the ancient site, and you can look down, and there's 4 temples. And this is not the Forum, so it's you wouldn't be dealing with any of, like, that high profile, like, the spirit of Rome stuff. This is just a set of 4 temples, basically, that were included in Pompey's theater as part of the Curia when he built it. And so this site is immaculately well preserved. Some of the original stones are there, and we have a general idea of what they all look like. So in my opinion, like, I think that'd be a great place to start. And there's the added historicity factor of Pompey's Curia is where Julius Caesar was assassinated. So, like, one of the key pivotal events in the entire history of, like, Western civilization, we could conceivably go to that place, you know, like, because there is Augustus put a stone there as a memorial, so we know exactly where it happened. They have that spot still picked out. So, like, to build what we project the building to have looked like at the time on March 14th, 44 BC, like, to me that would just be the coolest thing.
And I'm sure, being that Pompey's Curia is a place where the Roman Senate met, most notably when Caesar was stabbed, I'm sure that in all that time Caesar took a shit there at least once.
Yeah, exactly. So we have it coming from both ends. The minor, the daily aspects of life could be imagined as alongside the more macabre episodes that have kind of defined the trajectory of politics and history for 2,000 years.
Also, whichever guy is first to set up a booth or a cart in the reconstructed Pompey's Curia selling Pugios, selling souvenir daggers that you could take home, come on.
Would he make a killing?
I think he would make a killing. He would.
So, yeah, I mean, that's about as bold as I'll get. I'm not going to say that we should rebuild the Forum tomorrow or the Colosseum. But, I think the Curia of Pompey is a interesting place where we could start. It's not even a place that's open to tourists at the moment because the modern street is so high above the ancient site. It's a sanctuary for cats at the moment. So I think it's like tightly controlled. It's very small. It would just be a cool, and it's near the Pantheon, which is famously the best preserved Roman temple by a mile. It's not even close. It's because it was a Catholic church for so long, so it never fell into disrepair. But even that building was restored multiple times. It was originally constructed by Marcus Agrippa, and then in the 2nd century, Hadrian basically gave it an entire facelift, was nice enough to leave Agrippa's name on the inscription up front. So now everyone thinks Agrippa did it. But I think that the Pantheon poses an important question to the people who would be like against any efforts to rebuild Rome, because, it's that dome of ancient concrete. I think it's still the largest freestanding concrete dome in the world. 2,000 years of history, if we discovered some structural issues with that could not be resolved through historically accurate maintenance or bracing or something that the Romans would have had access to, do you really think anybody would say, well, we need to just let it collapse and fall into disrepair? Or would they say, like, no, it's fine to inject? Like, it's just such an interesting question to me of, like, what's the line between, like, preserving and restoring, right? Like, where do we draw that line? How do we define where one ends, one begins, and what category is which?
I think that's a great thought experiment. I think it really touches on all the major issues that we're facing with this question. Or, if something were to happen tomorrow, like there were an earthquake directly beneath the Pantheon and it were completely destroyed. In effect, you're dealing with the same phenomenon. You're rebuilding something that has ceased to be. Mm-hmm. But again, I can't see anyone mounting serious objections to that. If the Pantheon were destroyed tomorrow, I think there wouldn't be any question as to whether it should be rebuilt.
Right. And I think that it's an interesting thought experiment because, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, there's 3 freestanding columns just hanging out in a corner. So some of it is still there, right? Like, it's like, hey, we're just restoring it. So we're not rebuilding it. But yeah, I think obviously that's apples and oranges. I'm not positing an actual, connection there, but the Pantheon, I think, does present like the strongest case in like just looking at it from that vantage point, of somebody who is an advocate for a rebuild of these classical sites, because we are rebuilding, we are restoring, we are maintaining. Someone sweeps the floors in the Pantheon right now. Someone probably vacuums the floors. Like, they're not doing it with the brushes and the reeds that the Romans used to clean the place. Like, we're fine with a certain degree of modern technological insight and know-how being used to maintain the sites already. So,
and if we consider that the Romans they lived through a significant facelift of the Pantheon with Hadrian, as you mentioned. From what we can tell, I don't think the Romans looked at the refinished Pantheon and said, well, that's not the real one. That's fake. That's the new Pantheon. The attitude, as far as we know, is that it was still the Pantheon. And so I think we can assume that in the event of that hypothetical earthquake that destroyed the Pantheon tomorrow, if we were to rebuild it, I don't think there would be a prevailing attitude that it wasn't the real Pantheon anymore. I think in a situation like that, when the circumstances are so near at hand, everybody accepts that you have to rebuild old things sometimes because they fall down and things happen to them. which kind of leads us back to Namdaemun Gate, because as you mentioned, the prevailing attitude in Seoul seems to be that when people look at this gate, the sense is not that this is a replacement. It's not a fake. When people look at it, they see the gate that has always been there. But what makes it especially interesting to consider is that the gate that burned down in 2008 wasn't even the original gate.
Yeah, that's right. And it's bizarre because in 2008 there was such an outpouring of grief because there was a popular belief that this was a 500-year-old building that was traced back to the very, origins of what, what became modern Korean society. But in reality, the foundations, I suppose you could say, were originally laid in 1398, but there were complete rebuilds in 1447, but also in 1961, a complete rebuild because the building was just ravaged by the Korean War. There were multiple battles fought in Seoul between North Korean and South Korean forces, and though it survived the Japanese colonial occupation, which is one of the reasons it became a national symbol of endurance, it did not do so well through the Korean War, which really comes as no surprise. But that there was a multi-year effort to restore it back to its original state in the 60s, and that happened. And then, amazingly, within 50 years, people are treating this gate that is effectively only 50 years old as 500 years old because it inherited all of the symbolism, the representational power of the original. That's because, it was a good reconstruction, but nobody thought about that when it burned down. They were upset about a 500-year-old building burning down, which to me is just very phenomenal and is kind of indicative of the fact that I think we're so hesitant to do a rebuild of any of these classical sites because, oh no, I'm putting my 2023 fingerprints on this. But if you really look at this from the perspective of, well, I want someone in 3023 to look at this and be able to enjoy it, right? Then, hey, it was out of commission for 2,000 years, but it's been around for 1,000 years since. I think these buildings would inherit their former grandeur and their former sense of antiquity, if reconstructed well, if reconstructed thoughtfully and done in a way that is not as a tourist trap, then they could have the grandeur and I think a lot of people just don't think the mysticism could ever be there, that would be lost forever. And I really just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, really, when we're talking about reconstructions of historical structures, it all kind of boils down to a Ship of Theseus type situation where, if you replace one hinge on a door, is it still the same building? If you, like you said, if you sweep the floor, if you remove some of the original dirt that was on the floor, is it still the same building? And ultimately, I just don't think that ends up being all that important. What's really important about these historic structures, whether they exist as ruins, whether they're reconstructed, updated structures, what really matters is the ability for people, or the ability of people who are visiting to invest their imagination in the structure, to understand something more about the history of the place they're in, to understand something more about the people who once inhabited that place. I think ultimately the value of these sort of exercises of rebuilding and reconstruction it comes down to empathy, I think. It comes down to being able to put yourselves in the shoes of people who used to live there, to have more of a real sense of what their lives may have been like. And I think that's valuable. That's ultimately why I think I would find myself coming down on the side of at least limited reconstruction, limited rebuilding.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's where I am right now as well. And it's not honestly where I expected to be before we started researching this topic. And I started to really think about it. There is a sense of me that feels like it's just inherently wrong, but I can't determine why that is. I can't nail down any particular feeling as to why that would be. And the more I think about it, the more I think that, there's nothing wrong with limited reconstruction efforts in some places, as long as it's handled responsibly and in keeping with the history and traditions of the site. So, wow, we did actually come to a conclusion. I thought we were going to be like the Roman Senate and just talk in circles and let the problems fester while the Republic collapsed. But it appears that we actually had a reasonable dialogue and both are of one mind about this.
That's right. When you only have two voices to consider, it simplifies the process greatly.
Yeah, well, my co-consul and I are in agreement, so we will be enacting this policy upon the city of Rome. And let us know, though, if you agree, what you feel about this. If you think we're absolutely insane, Americans with no taste and no history, which is fair, then do let us know. But that's where we come down on it. I imagine there's a full gambit of opinions on it. So leave a comment below, or let us know if there's any glaring omission that you felt like we missed out on.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and you can find Tribunate somewhere in Rome selling souvenir daggers in the very near future.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, and we'll see you soon.
Take care. Bye, y'all.